Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you all how I make one of the most popular pens that I make. It is the Deerhunter pen. It's a bolt action design pen. This is my personal pen. This is one that I have had for a good while. You can see that it's got quite a bit of wear on it. It is, it stays in my pocket. It's been dropped. I use this thing on a daily basis. It's been a great pen. It's really been nice to use, and people ask me about it all the time. Whenever I take it out to sign something, I mean, it's just real common for somebody to start asking me questions about this pen. Anyways, I'm going to show you some of the steps involved in making one of the Deerhunter Bolt Action Pens. Alright guys, here is my wood supply for the pens, a lot of the pens that I make, and what we're going to do is just get a piece of the walnut, bust a piece, with an axe, and then mill it down to some pen size blanks. Once you get the wood cut down to a manageable size, what you will do is to take your brass tube, you can see one here, this is for a different style pen that I make, and cut the blank slightly longer than what your brass tube is. This is how you will generally judge the length to cut your wood, is by using the tube. And the tube is actually what holds a lot of the mechanical components of your pen. This is one of the blanks that I've cut from the walnut that you had seen earlier, and this is what we're going to be using for the Deerhunter pen. I've already got the brass tube epoxied into this wood. I've drilled it just to slightly larger. You don't want a real tight fit to where you can damage your tube trying to put it in, but you want it to be kind of snug going in. There are a lot of people that will just use a super glue when they make a pen. I like to take it a step further and actually use a two-part epoxy. You'll get a much better hold from something like this. I mean, they will not come apart when you put them together with this epoxy. And once that sets up, the next step is to square up the ends and get it ready to put on the lathe. One of the tools that you're going to need for making your pens is one of these mills. This is a specially designed drill bit that does a couple of things. The first thing that it does is clean all of the excess epoxy out of the brass tube once you have it glued up. The second thing that it does is ensures that the end is squared with that tube. The way that it does that, of course, there are various sizes of these that you can get. You want to get one that is a fairly decent fit. It slips up and down on there, but there's no wobble in it. You want to get one that sets in the pen blank fairly stable. Once you have your drill and everything set up, you'll have this clamped in a vise, and these cutters will trim the excess wood off. You're going to be careful when you do that, because the one thing you don't want to do is actually cut into that brass tube. If you cut into your brass tube and shorten it up too much, the mechanics of your pen are not going to work correctly. So now we're just going to square up this blank, and it will be ready to put on the lathe. When I use the end mill to square up the end, I will usually run it down until it just barely touches the brass. You can see how that it's just a slight polish on the brass on each end of this. Now, since that bit fits fairly snug into the brass tube, and since it cuts into the end of the wood at a perfectly 90-degree angle, once you trim this up, when you assemble your pen, if you've trimmed it correctly, there should not be any gaps in between the components of your pen and the wood. You should not see anything. It should be a smooth transition. Now that we have that ready, we are ready to chuck this piece of wood onto the lathe. And when we put the pen blank onto the lathe, what we use are some bushings that do two things. One is they help to stabilize the blank on the lathe, and they also act kind of as a guide to sizing your pen blank. What you'll want to do is to select a bushing that is pretty much the same size as some of the components that you're using for your pen, and that way as you're turning it you can kind of judge exactly how far down you need to cut the blank. If you cut it too far, it's not going to look right. You could actually cut into the brass tubing depending on the pen that you're trying to make, or if you cut it too big, it's going to kind of look bulky. It's not going to really have a good smooth transition from the wood to the mechanical components and the other components of your pen. So now we're going to get our bushings out and we're going to chuck our pen blank up on the lathe. These bushings are machined where they will go inside that brass tube and have very little play. You can see it setting inside that pen blank now. The other one I've already got sitting on my lathe. I've gotten a few spacers here to take up some of the space left on my mandrel. So I'm just going to slide the blank onto the mandrel. I'm going to add another spacer, and then I'm simply going to tighten it down onto the mandrel, and then we will be ready for turning. I generally start out just using a standard gouge. This is a smaller one that works great for pens, and depending on the pen that I'm doing, this could be the only tool that I use, or depending on the curvature that I'm going to be doing on the pen, I could use some of my other tools, the scraper. It just really depends on the style of pen that you're making. We know that we are ready to go, and the first thing we're going to do is to round over this piece of material and then start cutting the final profile of the pen. Now that I have the wood rounded over, I'm simply going to start cutting the profile. I've moved my tool rest closer to the pen to give my tool better support. So now we're just going to start cutting the profile of the pen. What I generally try to do is turn the pen material, the blank, down slightly above the thickness of my bushings. My bushings are sized to match the other components perfectly. That's something that really helps in making the pens. When you're turning them down, you know exactly how far to go. As you turn your pen, or the way that I do it, I will turn it slightly above the bushing. It will not be flush with the bushing, but it will be very close. And then I will just take a very coarse grit sandpaper and sand the pen blank down flush with the bushing. That way it lowers the risk of tear out. If you're not careful, you will tear out some of the material right where the pen blank meets the bushing, and then you've ruined your pen when you do that. So by turning it down slightly above the pen bushing, the bushing here, I can finish it with the sandpaper, get a little bit better control when I'm making my pens. This is an 80 grit paper. It's great for removing a lot of material very quickly. It also helps to even up a lot of the tooling marks that is on the pen blank. And we will go from this up through a couple of grits before we start applying our finish. We're starting to get close to where we need to be, but we're just going to keep going a little bit more to have a very smooth transition. Once we have the pen sanded smoothly, it's time to start applying the finish, and that's what we're going to be doing now. You'll want to add several thin coats of finish to the pen. That way the final finish will be much smoother. Using a fine grit sandpaper to sand between each coat will give you a much better finish. I usually add several coats of finish to the pens. That way the final finish is very glossy. However, some of the styles of the pens that I do are a little different, and on those I will sometimes leave a little softer finish, but it's really up to you on the type of finish that you want to put on your pens. We've added several coats of finish to this pen. What we're going to do now is to give it a very light sanding with some 600 grit paper, and from that I'm actually going to start using some rubbing compound to really help bring this surface to a very high gloss. You want to be careful that you don't cut through the finish on your pen. If you do, you're going to have to start from scratch. But it's all part of the learning process. And once we have that sanded, we're going to start with our polishing compound. When you're applying the polishing compound, try to add just a little bit of pressure on it to build up just a little bit of friction, and it will help to polish the finish down very nicely. After I've added a few coats of the polish, I will let the pen sit for a couple of minutes to haze over. That polish will turn to just a slight white haze, and once it does that, I will finish buffing out the polishing compound. After the buffing compound is polished out, I will then start applying several coats of wax. I've just finished buffing out the final coat of wax. We're ready to take the pen blank off of the lathe, take it over to the workbench, and start assembling the components onto the pen. The first thing that I will do in assembling the Deerhunter pen is to take the nib and just slightly press it into the pen blank. It's not going to go all the way. And after I get it started in there, I'll put it into my vise and actually press the nib into the pen blank. As you go to press the pen together, you need to be careful that the nib stays straight as you're pressing. If it starts to go sideways, you can actually destroy the pen. It can bust the blank, you can bend the nib, and it will ruin it. So just be very careful as you're pressing the components together to make sure that they go in properly. Here we have the nib pressed into the pen, and the next step is to press the bolt action mechanism into the pen as well. Here's the bolt action mechanism for our pen, and one of the things that I like to do when I go to assemble one of these is to ensure that the engraving that is on the nib is lined up with the buck head on the clip. I think it adds just a little bit better detail, a little bit better look to the pen. And I'll do it similar to the way that I did the front, is I'll just slightly wiggle the pen blank and the mechanism together just enough to get it started. And once that I have it properly lined up, I will then press the final pen together. Here we have the pen pressed together. The last step is to insert the ink cartridge. The way that we do that is to unscrew the very tip of the bullet. And once we have that unscrewed, you want to make sure that the bolt action is all the way back. That way you're not compressing the spring as hard. And simply take the pen cartridge. These Parker cartridges are readily available at any of your office supply stores. Simply drop that into the pen. You will then take the spring cartridge, screw the tip onto the pen, and you're ready to go. You have your completed Deerhunter Bolt Action Pen.